welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about another major escalation in the war in Iran. And this one really does change everything. Because for the first time in this conflict, we are now seeing direct US personnel at serious risk, with a US fighter jet shot down, a pilot missing, and the possibility that this situation could spiral into something far more dangerous. At the same time, Iran is now continually targeting energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Oil prices are now surging to close to $110 per barrel. Aviation is being disrupted globally. And yet, when you look at the stock market, you wouldn't think any of this was happening. And I think that's the real story here, because what we're seeing right now is a growing disconnect between reality and what's priced into the financial markets. So this is no longer just a war that's going on in the Middle East that has no impact on anybody. This is becoming a major global economic event that markets may not be fully prepared for. And in today's video, I want to walk you through exactly what's happening, why the markets are not reacting in the way you might expect, and what could happen next. But before we get into all of that, if you haven't already subscribed, could I ask you to please hit that red subscribe button below? It doesn't take more than a second, and it really does help me with the algorithm. Also puts a smile on my face. Now let's start with the key development, because yesterday Iran shot down a US F-15 fighter jet. Now this is hugely significant. Up until now, the narrative coming out from the USA, particularly from Donald Trump, has been that Iran's air defences have been largely neutralised, that the US had effective control of the skies, and that operations could be carried out with minimal risk. But clearly, after yesterday's events, that is not the case. If Iran is capable of shooting down a frontline US fighter jet, then its air defence systems are still operational, still effective, and still a serious threat. And more importantly, this changes the entire perception of the war. Because up until now, this has felt to some extent like a remote conflict. Drones, missiles, long-range strikes, very little visible risk to US personnel. But now that illusion has disappeared. We now have a missing pilot, and that introduces a completely new risk. Because if that individual is captured, this becomes a hostage situation. And once you enter that territory, the political pressure increases dramatically, and the risk of escalation rises significantly. Now, alongside this military escalation, we're also seeing a major escalation in attacks on energy infrastructure. Iran has been targeting facilities across the Gulf, including a natural gas processing facility in the UAE and an oil refinery in Kuwait. And this is absolutely critical because energy remains the backbone of the global economy. If you disrupt oil and gas supplies, you disrupt everything. And the market reaction in oil has been immediately. Prices are now pushing towards $110 per barrel. And if you just think about that for a second, at the start of 2026, oil was sitting around $60 per barrel. And the expectations were that prices would fall during this year because the global economy was already slowing. So what we now have is the worst case scenario, a supply shock at the time of weakening demand. And historically, this combination has been extremely damaging because higher oil prices act like a tax on the global economy. They increase costs for businesses, increase prices for consumers, and ultimately reduce demand. So instead of supporting growth, this is going to slow things down further. And this obviously feeds directly into inflation because energy costs ripple through the entire system. Fuel, transport, food, manufacturing, everything becomes more expensive. And obviously we've talked recently about the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because traffic that passes through that narrow stretch of water equates to around 20% of all of the global oil and gas supplies every single day. So as they've been restricted, that's been restricting supply, causing problems, but we're also seeing shortages in things like ammonium nitrate needed for fertilizer, helium needed for the production of microchips and other medical equipment, and aluminium, which is used in basically everything these days. And central banks are now facing a very difficult situation because prior to this escalation, there was already uncertainty around interest rate cuts. But now, with oil rising and inflation risks increasing, there is a growing possibility that rates stay higher for longer, or potentially that central banks delay any easing entirely, and they may even increase rates in some countries. We've already seen that in Australia. And that has huge implications for borrowing, for investment, and for overall economic activity. But here's where things get really interesting, because despite all of this, despite the escalation, the rising oil prices, the increasing risks, stock markets have not reacted in the way you would expect. Yes, we've seen movements in raw materials, oil and gas are up, energy related assets are moving, but broader equity markets, they've been relatively resilient. And that raises a very important question. Are markets underestimating the risks? Because right now it doesn't look like the full economic impact of this conflict has been priced in. And that creates a potential problem, because markets tend to adjust very quickly once sentiment changes. So what we could be seeing here is a lag, the delay between reality and market pricing. Now, there are a few reasons why this might be happening. Firstly, markets may still believe that this conflict will be short-lived, that there will be some form of resolution or de-escalation in the near term. But based on what we're seeing, that doesn't look likely, because Iran is showing no signs of backing down, no signs of surrender, no signs of moving towards a peace deal. In fact, it's the opposite. The shooting down of that fighter jet is a clear signal that Iran still has capability and is willing to use it. And the targeting of energy infrastructure shows a deliberate strategy to apply pressure on the global economy. Secondly, markets may be assuming that the impact will remain contained, that this won't spread beyond the Middle East. But again, that assumption is being tested, because we're now seeing disruption to global aviation. Flight routes are being diverted, airspace is being avoided, and the entire model that has dominated long-haul travel for the past 20 years is under pressure. Airlines that rely on hubs in the Middle East are facing significant challenges. At the same time, fuel costs are rising sharply, and that means higher ticket prices, and when prices go up, demand goes down. So we're now seeing a reduction in flight volumes, and this has been going on for weeks. We're into around week 6 of this conflict, and aviation activity is still below normal levels. So when you bring all of this together, what you have is a growing list of risks: military escalation, energy disruption, rising oil and gas prices, inflation pressure, central bank uncertainty, and now global aviation disruption. And yet, equity markets are still holding up, which suggests that either markets are right or markets are missing something. So what happens next? Well, there are a few possible scenarios here. If this conflict de-escalated quickly, then the markets may be justified. Oil prices could come back down rapidly, inflation pressures could ease, and the global economy could stabilise. But based on current developments, that doesn't look like the most likely outcome, because everything we're seeing right now points towards further escalation, not de-escalation. Iran is not backing down, the US is now directly exposed, and energy infrastructure is being targeted. And the more likely scenario is that oil prices remain elevated or move higher, inflation pressures increase, and central banks remain cautious, and that economic growth slows further. And if that happens, then markets will have to adjust, because you can have a situation where energy prices are rising, growth is slowing, inflation is increasing, and yet equity markets remain relatively stable. At some point, those things have to align, and when they do, that adjustment can happen very quickly. So the key takeaway from all of this is that the risks have increased for the global economy significantly. The shooting down of that fighter jet changes the narrative. It shows that Iran still has capability. It shows that US personnel are at risk, and it increases the likelihood of further escalation. At the same time, the targeting of energy infrastructure is pushing oil prices higher, which is going to have a direct and immediate impact on the global economy. And yet, the markets don't appear to have fully priced that in. And I think that is where the real risk lies. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like it but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. It's another way of helping fund the channel, hopefully a bit of fun. Thank you also to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really do appreciate it. And also I wanted to remind you that I've recently launched a new channel, Joe and Naz. We're doing lots of really fun things, and the whole ethos here is food, fun, and banter. So it's quite entertaining. Hopefully you will enjoy it. Our latest video has just been released, and it's a really good one. We went to Gordon Ramsay's plain food at Heathrow Airport. So if you could help us out by watching that video and maybe subscribing to the channel and watching some of the other videos, I would really appreciate that. If you just click on the little video that comes up at the end of today's video, it'll take you straight through into that Gordon Ramsay video. And here's something else in the meantime to put a smile on your face.